On the morning of August 10th, 2019, inside a high-security facility in Manhattan, Jeffrey Epstein was discovered unresponsive in his cell. The reports labeled it a tragic end by his own hand. But the details that surfaced never quite aligned. The surveillance cameras outside his room, not working. The staff scheduled to check on him, they hadn't. And the most closely watched detainee in the country, a man whose connections reached into palaces and presidential offices, was suddenly gone. The public was told the case had reached its conclusion. But for many, that moment only deepened the mystery. Because Epstein's story isn't simply about how it ended, it's about how it ever began. To understand why his name still lingers like a shadow, you have to go back. Back to the unlikely path that carried him from a modest Brooklyn upbringing to the private rooms of the world's most powerful. Jeffrey Edward Epstein grew up far from wealth. His father tended city parks, his mother worked in a school. They lived in Brooklyn, in a small brick home, ordinary in every way. Yet from a young age, Epstein showed an unusual sharpness with numbers. He skipped grades, excelled in math, and left high school early. But college was a different story. Restless, unfocused, he dropped out without a degree. By all measures, his career should have stalled before it started. And yet, in 1974, Epstein appeared in one of the most exclusive classrooms in New York. As a teacher at Dalton, a prep school reserved for the city's wealthiest families. The position should have required credentials he didn't have. Still, the door opened. Students remembered him as unconventional. He dressed more like a nightclub regular than a math teacher, driving flashy cars and carrying himself with a swagger that stood out in Dalton's polished halls. He was young, charismatic, but unsettling in ways some couldn't quite define. His time at Dalton was short. Complaints about his conduct mounted, and within 2 years he was dismissed. For most, this would have been the end of the story. But Dalton wasn't just a school, it was a crossroads. Its students were heirs to Manhattan's financial elite, and Epstein had found his way into their orbit. One introduction led to another, and soon he was in the office of Alan Ace Greenberg, the powerful head of Bear Stearns, a major Wall Street firm. Despite his lack of degree or license, Bear Stearns hired Epstein as an assistant trader in 1976. It was his first real step into high finance, and it revealed a pattern that would follow him for the rest of his life. Opportunities arriving where none should exist, doors opening without explanation. Epstein wasn't climbing the ladder, he was skipping rungs, and at Bear Stearns the world would begin to see just how far he was willing to go. When Jeffrey Epstein stepped into Bear Stearns in 1976, he entered a world built on aggression, instinct, and risk. He had no degree, no MBA, none of the usual credentials. But he did have something that set him apart. He could read numbers like a language, and he understood how to talk his way into trust. At first, he was just another junior employee running numbers for the options trading desk. But it didn't take long for Epstein's knack for solving complex problems and his boldness in bending rules to catch attention. He rose quickly, earning promotions that baffled some of his colleagues. Then came the first real scandal. In the early 1980s, Epstein was implicated in a questionable deal involving insider information. For most people, this would have spelled career death. But instead of being crushed, he walked away. Bear Stearns quietly parted ways with him. No charges, no long shadow over his record. And here, a curious pattern emerged again. Epstein seemed to fail upward. When one door closed, a bigger one opened. By the mid-1980s, Epstein had reinvented himself as a financial consultant. He launched his own firm, Intercontinental Assets Group, specializing in recovering money from troubled debts. But according to some who crossed paths with him, his role was murkier, navigating deals where money and influence blurred. He moved in circles where discretion was currency. Then came the connection that transformed his trajectory. Leslie Wexner, the billionaire founder of L Brands, the company behind Victoria's Secret. Wexner was one of the richest men in America, and yet for reasons that remain mysterious, he handed Epstein extraordinary control over his fortune. Epstein became not just an advisor, but the primary manager of Wexner's vast wealth. At one point, he had power of attorney, the ability to sign checks, buy property, even borrow money on Wexner's behalf. It was an astonishing level of trust, and no one ever fully explained why. With Wexner's backing, Epstein's lifestyle exploded. He acquired a 7-story mansion on Manhattan's Upper East Side, one of the largest private homes in the city. He bought a private jet. He set up an office in the Caribbean. His wealth appeared endless, though the exact mechanics of how he made it remained opaque. To many in finance, Epstein was an enigma. He had no hedge fund that anyone could find, no trail of public trades, no visible empire, and yet he moved through the world with the swagger of a billionaire. Some whispered that his real currency wasn't money at all, but secrets, that he thrived in the gray areas where influence and information carried more weight than cash. Others believed his fortune came from shadowy investment deals on behalf of ultra-wealthy clients who valued one thing above all else: silence. Whatever the truth, by the early 1990s, Epstein had become something unusual. A man without a clear empire, yet powerful enough to dine with presidents, princes, and professors from the world's most elite institutions. But with new heights came darker shadows, because Epstein wasn't just surrounding himself with billionaires and academics. He was also building another network, one that would eventually reveal the true horror behind his wealth. And at the center of that web stood a woman whose name would one day be inseparable from his, Ghislaine Maxwell. In the 1990s, Jeffrey Epstein's world shifted once more when he became inseparable from Ghislaine Maxwell. She was the daughter of the late media baron Robert Maxwell, a man whose empire had spanned publishing and politics before it collapsed in scandal. When her father died suddenly at sea, Ghislaine sought a new life in New York. There, she aligned herself with Epstein, and the two became constant companions. Maxwell was more than a partner. She was a passport into circles that few outsiders could ever enter. With her aristocratic charm and well-placed connections, she smoothed Epstein's path into high society. Suddenly, the boy from Brooklyn who once taught math without a degree was now hosting and mingling with some of the most recognizable names in the world. By the mid-1990s, Epstein was being photographed alongside Donald Trump, then a flamboyant real estate mogul and celebrity fixture. They were seen together at Mar-a-Lago in Palm Beach, at social events in Manhattan, and in photographs that would later become infamous. In one old interview, Trump casually noted Epstein's taste for younger women, a remark that decades later would sound far more chilling in hindsight. Across the Atlantic, Epstein's ties to royalty raised even more eyebrows. His friendship with Prince Andrew, Duke of York, was well documented. They were spotted walking in Central Park, relaxing at Epstein's Manhattan mansion, and traveling on his private jet. Even after Epstein's first round of legal trouble, photographs showed the prince in his company, evidence of a bond that would one day bring intense public scrutiny. And these were only the most visible names. Epstein's guest list stretched from professors at Ivy League universities to Silicon Valley pioneers, Wall Street magnates, Nobel Prize winners, and even former heads of state. At his Manhattan mansion, one of the largest private homes in the city, a dinner could include a Nobel laureate, a Hollywood actor, and a future president, all seated at the same table. To outsiders, Epstein seemed like a connector, the man who knew everyone. But behind the charm, suspicions grew. Why was he collecting such a wide range of powerful friends? Why did so many people seem to owe him favors, or at least tolerate his presence? Later reports and testimonies would suggest a darker side, that Epstein wasn't just building friendships, but possibly weaving a web of influence. That his homes weren't simply stages for glittering parties, but places where private behavior might later be used as quiet leverage. By the late 1990s, the whispers had grown louder. People began to wonder, was Epstein's fortune really measured in money or in the secrets he kept? Because while he traveled the globe with celebrities, royals, and tycoons, back in Palm Beach, Florida, the first cracks in his empire were about to open, cracks that no amount of charm could conceal. By the early 2000s, Jeffrey Epstein's lifestyle seemed untouchable. He had private jets, an island hideaway, and mansions scattered across America. In Palm Beach, Florida, his estate stood out even among the city's wealthiest. A sprawling waterfront home with towering gates, manicured lawns, and a steady stream of visitors. But behind those walls, long circulating whispers began to take a more serious form. In 2005, the Palm Beach Police Department received a troubling complaint from a local family. Their daughter claimed she had been invited to Epstein's mansion under the pretense of giving a massage. What she described next raised alarm. That first report was only the beginning. As investigators looked closer, they uncovered a repeated pattern. Dozens of young women, many still in school, told similar stories of being drawn in with promises of quick cash. Some said they were encouraged to bring along friends. The accounts painted a disturbing picture. Girls arriving through the side door, greeted by staff, and led upstairs to Epstein's private quarters. Different voices from different neighborhoods, yet all describing the same rooms, the same setup, the same outcome.
She's like, oh, do you need to make any extra money? I'm like, yeah. She's like, okay, I can give you, like $200. It's this older guy in Palm Beach. He gets a lot of massages from girls.
For the Palm Beach police chief, it was one of the most concerning cases he had ever handled. His team compiled a 53-page dossier with statements from multiple witnesses. In their eyes, the evidence was overwhelming. But when the case moved forward, something unusual happened. Federal prosecutors intervened, removing it from local control. What followed became one of the most controversial agreements in modern legal history. In 2008, after years of delays, Epstein secured what is now known as a non-prosecution deal. Instead of facing federal charges that could have meant decades behind bars, he pled guilty to 2 reduced state charges. His sentence? 18 months in county jail. Even that punishment was softened. Epstein was granted a work release program that allowed him to leave the facility for up to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Reports suggest he often returned only to sleep. For the women who had spoken out, it was a crushing blow. More than 30 were named in the investigation, yet the agreement ended any chance for a full trial. For Epstein, it was little more than a setback. The most extraordinary detail of all, the deal didn't just protect Epstein, it also extended immunity to unnamed potential co-conspirators. When Epstein walked free in 2009 after serving just 13 months, many assumed the story was finished. His reputation was damaged, yes, but he remained wealthy, connected, and still mingling with the rich and powerful. Most men in his position would have disappeared into obscurity. Epstein did the opposite. He re-emerged, hosting dinners with tech pioneers, academics, and world leaders, as if nothing had happened. The world, it seemed, had given him a second chance, and he intended to use it. But behind the scenes, the tide was shifting. Journalists were circling, survivors were raising their voices louder than ever, and soon, Epstein's so-called deal of a lifetime would come under fire. When Jeffrey Epstein walked out of jail in 2009, he should have been finished. He was now a registered offender, his name splashed across newspapers, his Palm Beach estate marked forever. Most men in his position would have vanished into quiet exile. But Epstein didn't retreat, he re-emerged. And shockingly, the doors of high society opened for him once again. In Manhattan, his 7-story mansion became a stage for carefully curated salons. He hosted dinners that pulled in Nobel Prize winners, Ivy League professors, tech innovators, even former heads of state. His guest lists blurred the line between intellectual prestige and raw power. For some, the invitation was irresistible. The chance to sit at a table where the world's problems and solutions were casually debated over fine wine. But for Epstein, these gatherings weren't charity, they were transactions. Each dinner, each handshake was a chance to rebuild the very image he had lost. One of his most infamous pursuits during this period was science. He poured money into research, courting some of the most brilliant minds in genetics, physics, and artificial intelligence. Epstein positioned himself as a patron of discovery, a man funding the future. Yet whispers circulated that his interest in science carried ulterior motives, ambitions to leave a legacy, perhaps even to manipulate life itself. Socially, his ties to the elite remained startling. Photographs placed him at dinners with Prince Andrew long after his conviction. His past friendship with Donald Trump remained part of the public record, though Trump would later distance himself.
I don't understand why the Jeffrey Epstein case would be of interest to anybody. It's pretty boring stuff.
Even Bill Clinton was documented flying on Epstein's private jet multiple times, though Clinton denied ever visiting his island. Each of these connections fueled the sense that Epstein existed in a world where reputation bent to money and influence. But while Epstein was rebuilding his circle, forces outside were circling him. Investigative journalists, most notably at the Miami Herald, began revisiting the 2008 plea deal. Survivors who had once been silenced were speaking again, and this time their voices were amplified across digital platforms. By the mid-2010s, lawsuits piled up. Court filings revealed disturbing details about Epstein's network, about Maxwell's alleged role in recruiting, and about the extraordinary lengths to which deals had been cut to protect him. Each revelation chipped away at the illusion that he could ever fully return to normal life. And yet, until 2019, Epstein moved freely between his Manhattan townhouse, his Caribbean island, and his private jets. The very fact that he seemed untouchable only deepened the public's fascination. But the tide was turning. Survivors refused to be silenced. Journalists refused to stop digging. And by 2019, the cracks in his armor would finally split wide open. By 2019, Jeffrey Epstein was still living like a man untouched by scandal. His Manhattan townhouse, worth tens of millions, stood as a fortress of wealth. His private jets carried him between Palm Beach, Paris, and the Caribbean. On the surface, it looked like nothing had changed, but beneath the surface, pressure was building. Investigative journalists at the Miami Herald had reignited the story, exposing the scale of Epstein's 2008 deal and giving survivors a platform that couldn't be ignored. Their reporting drew national outrage, forcing the legal system to take a second look. In July 2019, everything collapsed. Epstein was arrested at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey after returning from Paris. He was charged with sex trafficking of minors, accused of luring dozens of underage girls into a scheme that spanned years and locations. The details were horrifying. Prosecutors alleged that Epstein had created a vast network where young women were recruited, groomed, and abused, not only by him, but sometimes by others in his orbit. Court documents referenced his island in the U.S. Virgin Islands, often nicknamed Little St. James, where survivors described it as a place of nightmares disguised as paradise. His Palm Beach estate, his ranch in New Mexico, his Manhattan mansion, all of them were painted as pieces of a web designed to exploit the vulnerable. And now, unlike in 2008, Epstein's connections couldn't shield him. The outrage was too widespread. The story was too big. The world was watching. The arrest sent shockwaves across the globe, not only because of the crimes, but because of who Epstein had once called friends. Photographs, flight logs, and social appearances showed him alongside figures from politics, royalty, academia, and entertainment. The whispers about who knew what suddenly turned into headlines. Meanwhile, Epstein's Manhattan townhouse was raided. Inside, authorities found safes filled with cash, diamonds, and, most disturbingly, piles of photographs, many showing young women. For the first time, it seemed like the walls were closing in. And yet, the man who had slipped through cracks for decades still projected confidence. He pleaded not guilty. His attorneys argued for bail, offering to put up hundreds of millions in assets to secure his release. But the judge refused. Epstein was deemed too great a flight risk. From that moment, Epstein sat inside a New York detention center, awaiting trial. For the survivors, it was a long-awaited moment of justice, the chance to finally face the man who had haunted their past. But as the world soon learned, Epstein's story would not end in a courtroom. It would end in a way that only deepened the mystery, leaving questions that remain unanswered to this day. On the morning of August 10th, 2019, Jeffrey Epstein's story ended inside a New York detention center. The official report stated that he had taken his own life. But almost immediately, the details raised more questions than answers. 2 guards assigned to check on him every 30 minutes, they admitted they had fallen asleep. The cameras trained on the hallway outside his cell malfunctioned that very night. The most notorious detainee in America, a man whose testimony could have exposed names in politics, business, and royalty, was suddenly silenced before a single witness could take the stand. The announcement sparked a wave of disbelief. Across social media, hashtags exploded. In late-night talk shows and family kitchens alike, people repeated the same phrase, "This doesn't add up." Theories flooded the public sphere. Some insisted it was negligence, a broken system failing at its most crucial moment. Others believed Epstein's knowledge of the powerful made him too dangerous to stand trial. The truth, perhaps, may never be known. What is known is this: when Epstein died, so did the chance for many survivors to face him in court. Their voices were heard in civil suits and documentaries, but the criminal trial that could have exposed the full scope of his operation vanished with him. Still, the ripples didn't stop. In 2020, Ghislaine Maxwell was arrested and later convicted for her role in recruiting and grooming young women for Epstein's network. Her conviction confirmed what many survivors had said all along: Epstein had not acted alone. But Maxwell's trial too left lingering gaps. The full list of Epstein's associates, the depth of his connections, and the secrets he may have kept locked in his safes remain shrouded in silence. Flight logs, photographs, and testimonies reveal fragments, but never the whole picture. To this day, Epstein's name evokes anger, suspicion, and unanswered questions. How did a man with no degree, no hedge fund, and no obvious empire build such influence? How many people in his orbit knew more than they ever admitted? And perhaps the darkest question of all, how much remains hidden? Epstein's life was not just a story of wealth and excess. It was a story about power, how it's gained, how it's abused, and how it shields itself when threatened. His death ended his trial, but it didn't end the shadow he cast. Because every time a new name surfaces, every time a new photograph is unearthed, every time a survivor speaks, the world is reminded that Jeffrey Epstein may be gone, but the web he spun still lingers. And the final truth? We may never know how deep it really went.